Hey folks, welcome to another episode of ASP.NET Core from Zero to Overkill. This will be part 2 of this sub-series on integrating Identity Server into our application. So in this episode, we will take a look at the changes made to the Auth service. So in the previous episode, we started with an overview of the application architecture so far, how the authentication process flows from the single page application, back for front, authentication service, and all of that. And we saw how we are going to use OpenID Connect in this application, so for the authentication flows. In this episode, we'll set up IdentityServer4 in the authentication service. So we will be using in-memory configurations. I think it's good enough for simple stuff like this. Not really a problem. We will integrate the identity server with ASP.NET Core Identity, because we could use identity server without it altogether. But since we are using identity for the authentication service already, we will integrate the two to make them work together. Not really that much work, it's just using some helper libraries. We'll integrate the operational store with AF Core. So operational store is where tokens, token information is stored. So for refresh tokens and stuff like that, or in case instead of a JWT, we were using a reference token, so it could be invalidated. It will be on the operation store, but we are using JWT. In this case, by default it works in memory, but this is useful to be on a database, so we will integrate it with EF Core, and we'll take a look at the consent screen. As you might remember from the previous episode, I just created it so we can see it as an example, but I will disable it eventually because it doesn't make sense for our application. And the usual plugs: if these videos are being useful, please consider liking them, sharing so we can get more people on board, and leave feedback so we can improve the videos going forward. So with this, let's take a look at the code. So over here, I have here the changes, the commits. So if we go to GitHub and want to see what's going on, take a look at this commit, the integrating the identity server. It's where all the changes are, and I'm checking it out to make sure I don't forget to mention something. So let's start over here. I did some reorganization of the startup class, which, if I remember, let's take a look. Startup. Where is it? It's over here. Yeah. I had everything in the startup class. I started cleaning it up, so created a bunch over here in IOC, created some extensions. So now it's clean up. So configured MVC, localization, identity, cookie is still over here, and created another new one, this case for identity server. So we'll see the changes in here in a minute. Over here, I think the only thing that was added was use identity server, so we can register all the endpoints for identity server in the application pipeline, just to make sure. Yeah, over here the only change was adding this one. So before taking a look at identity server, let's just check what happened over here. So I moved this here. You might remember this from the authentication episodes. I added this part. So besides the account requiring to be an authorized user, now we have a consent folder with the same requirement. Then localization. Again, this is what we already saw in the past. I just moved it to this helper extension method to clean up the startup class. Configured identity, again, the same we have already seen. So raising the DB context and the identity, all of that, which we already saw in the authentication episode. And this is from the framework, and this is the new one. This is where we are configuring identity server. So let's start looking at it. Okay, just remember, before looking at it, let's take a look at the new dependencies that were installed. So let's check the CS proj. So we added identity server, which is a core library with the features we need. Then identity server ASP.NET Identity to integrate identity server with identity, and identity server entity framework. So it provides a way to use entity framework for storage. The rest was already here. We already saw in latest episode. So let's check it out. So identity server already provides extension methods to help us configure everything. So this is just to create events for everything. So for logging and stuff like that. It's all true because we want to see what's going on. And then like notes. So we are using in memory, like I mentioned. We could also get it from the database, but I don't feel it's needed for this simple sample and application. So we use this. So add in memory identity resources. And this provides this information, like these are kind of scopes that we allow for the applications to get. So profile information, if we go here, so it's a scope profile, and then it says the claims that are part of this. Or better yet, it's a claim, the profile, it's a claim. Okay, so I'm doing this because OpenID, the scope is required by default. I could have this one over here, but I'm creating here to put it required true. So in the consent screen, because it's required, it immediately appears checked, and you cannot uncheck because it's needed. So let's get back to here. So this provides identity information about the user. Then API resources is the APIs that a client application can access in the name of the user. Again, notice this in memory. This is all in memory. So get APIs. So the only API we got so far is group management. So we are creating an API resource that is group management. And notice that these are all strings hard-coded. This is not a good idea because I'm spreading these strings all around. But for sample's sake, I think it's easier to read, but it's not really that good to maintain. So in the future, this should be factored into constants, so it's easier. Okay, so we are going to the scopes associated with the API, which by itself is like a scope, and telling it it's required and returning it. In the end, we can check out, let me see, do I have it? Yeah. I'll remove this. Let's log in again. And you can see, so the personal information appears here as required. The application access, so group management. Offline access we'll see in a minute. but this is needed because of the refresh token. If we don't have this, we can't have a refresh token, and we want a refresh token. So these are the things that are available. So we go, that's what we are configuring. So in the in-memory identity resources, we added this. In the in-memory APIs, there's this. Now we add in-memory clients, so the clients that can access this information. So let's check out. We have only one client, which is the web frontend, or that you might recognize the name for, is where the single page application and the back for front are. And then we have configuration specific for each client. We can have different clients, so we could have this client with the code flow, and then have a mobile client, a mobile application that would use like the implicit flow or the hybrid flow, for example. In this case, we only have one client, and we are in memory, so this is all hard coded here. But we could, and probably should, but have this in a database. But in that case, I had to create a UI to handle that, and I'm not in the mood, and it's not needed for these examples. So we have the clients here hard coded. Eventually some part of this will need to be from configuration. Right now it's all hard coded. So let's continue. So client ID, allowed grant types is where we select the type of flow we are going to use, so the code flow. Client secret is used to authenticate. It will be used along the client ID, and then the code when we are authorizing getting a token, we'll need the client secret. That's the thing that can only be really used in this code flow because it's in the backend and can keep the client secret. Then redirect URIs is important because it's the endpoints that are acceptable for redirect when we come back. So if the back for front redirects to the authorization service or authentication service to authenticate the user, but provides a redirect URI that's different from what's configured, it will be denied. So this is important. It's HTTP right now because in dev, but should be HTTPS. Then refresh token usage. We can configure this, so we can reuse the same refresh token. In this case, I put one time only because of reasons. No real reason. I don't know what's the default. But yeah, when we refresh, we can get a new refresh token, so we can always keep a new one. And then these are the scopes that this application requires. If this application, for instance, if we remove this one, the consent screen would be different. Let's check it out. Let's go. What about now? Oh, it isn't enough. Yeah, forget it. What's going on? 404. Okay, maybe because I left it in the middle of something. But if we remove this and the application says it doesn't need, it will stop being on the consent screen because it isn't required. But in this case, we want of this tree. So OpenID, profile information, and group management access. The allow offline access that appears on the consent screen comes from over here. If we set to false, it doesn't appear, but then we don't have access to refresh tokens. So access token lifetime is 60 seconds. Yeah, this is 60 seconds. It's not a good approach. It's just for, I just use this value so we can see when this is working, we can see the token be refreshed. We can set the expiration to be sliding or not, so absolute. Require consent. Like I mentioned, we can say that this client doesn't require consent. Right now it's by default true, but we will set it to false, and then the consent screen will no longer appear. And another thing worth noticing is that there are a lot of options. I'm just talking about the simple client, but if you are implementing this, you probably should check out a lot of the options. This is just the bare bones approach, as simple as possible. So continuing, we already saw so far, so in memory clients, we saw the client is just the web frontend. Then configuring identity server, integration with ASP.NET Core Identity. So add ASP.NET Identity and we pass the user. And now we get into database stuff. So like I mentioned, if we wanted the configuration instead of being in memory, being from the database, we could use this add configuration store. And needed to configure the DB context and stuff like that. We won't use it right now, but we'll use the operation store. So it's persisted across servers. Right now we only have one. And we have other problems regarding that we'll see in other episodes. But right now it works. But yeah, so we're using a database to store the operational data. So we use add operational store to configure that, and then over here configure the DB context. This DB context is not one I created for this. It exists in the identity server, and it's called a persistent grant DB context, if I'm not mistaken. So the only thing that was needed was to create the migrations. So over here in the migrations, Auth is the migrations we had created when developing the application the first time, and over here in the identity server are the migrations for the persistent grants. So, but creating the migrations is the same as usual. We create a migration, say that we want the startup class to be this one that has the config. So I added in the app settings development, I added this. So basically the same, just created another database. But what we did regarding migrations in previous episodes is exactly the same for this. Simply, it's not a DB context we created. So back here, we have all the DB context stuff. And then, because these grants, the tokens and stuff like that are used a lot, we can use in-memory caching, or we could provide our own implementation and then use this add resource store cache, some cache implementation. In this case, just in-memory caching, or in this case, because it's simple, we could have no cache and let it go to the database. But yeah, then important stuff. We need certificates to sign the JWT tokens. I haven't used it yet, so this is copied from the quick start. So in development we have developer sign-in credential. If we go here to you can see there's the there's a key. This one was created when even if I delete this one, because we are doing add developer sign-in credential, it is created. But of course this shouldn't be used in production, so we need to configure key. And that's about it over here. So this is the configuration for our identity server in the authentication service. It is kind of easy, I would say, because it's all done under the hood, and it's not a lot of code, but of course we need to know what's going on. So maybe just to review, we need identity resources, so to provide information about the user. In this case we don't have a lot, but it's like the username and stuff like that. We need to provide API resources, so the APIs that a client application can access in the name of the user. We need to configure the client applications, and this is most important stuff. The rest is integration things, so using databases, integrating with the ASP.NET identity, in-memory caching, and this signing stuff is important. So as we saw mostly the code for this, let's take a look a bit at what we can see during execution. So when we go around this, let me check. Over here we have a lot of logs, which is cool because in development we can see everything that's going on. So these are the logs for the authentication service. I have the other applications running here. This is the Auth service. So if you go here, ask to log in, so we can already see this request came in. Let me open the pointer application. So we have here an authorized request that's asking for the authorization code, so the client web front end and a lot of info that we have already seen. So it's asking for an authorization code for these scopes that we already saw, and a bunch more stuff OpenID Connect specific. Now we go over here and we can log in, go to the consent screen. I don't think there's much more. Yeah, the rest of the logs are the usual stuff. But now that we allow, we will be redirected to the client application, and a lot of requests will go on, as we already talked about. So coming back here, just for an overview, I won't be too going into much detail. So over here, this one, yeah, this is the return, what is returned. So authorization code, and then it's a code with this value that's provided. So through the front end, through a redirect, it goes back to the web front end application. We go down a bit, and then so client authentication was successful, and over here, yeah, this bit right here is where the web front end is making a back channel request with the authorization code that it received to ask for a token. So this is the authorization code that was passed, and then using the client ID, client secret, and all of that, it is able to obtain a token. So over here, some queries going on, and then the token issued using a authorization code. So it issues an ID token, a refresh token, and an access token. And do we have any more things over here? Yeah, over here. After getting this information, when this information is passed on to the backend, to the web frontend, the BFF, then with the access token, it can now make a request to the user info endpoint to get information about the user. So this is probably it. So token validation success. Custom token validator stuff, internal stuff. And yeah, so with the access token it can now make requests. This is the first request just to get some user info. Then it will use this access token to go to the group management and stuff like that. And now we can go here and grab information. Now just to wrap up, as I was forgetting, let's take a quick look at the consent page, which is over here on pages, consent. And it's basically just a page, Razor page. So let's start with the page model. We have a bunch of dependencies that are from IdentityServer. Like I mentioned, I copied this and made some adjustments, so I don't have a complete view of what's going on here, but a bunch of stuff. So the model to input is a button to say if we consent or not, the scopes that are consented, and that flag, as we saw. Let me go here, delete all of this. So yes or not, the scopes, and remember or not. So there are some options and some text. The result, which is used over here. In the quick start, this is in a bunch of different files, but I just merged it all together. Like I mentioned, I will delete this. So on get, we just build a model. Let's check this out. So given the return URL, we are able to get the context of the authorization request. So if we have it, we can get by the client ID the information, get the resources by scope and all of that. Fill consent model, what does this do? Yeah, so it prepares the information. So if it should be remembered, what scopes were consented previously, some enable offline access info, let's get back here. So this is preparing the information that will be shown over here. And can return. And then on post, we'll process, like you saw in other episodes regarding Razor pages. This is the input model, so using the bind property. That's why over here we don't get any more information as an argument, because it's bound that way. So in process consent, again getting the context given the return URL, checking if the button clicked was no or yes. There are some events going on. So we have that information that we saw on the on the logs. If yes, we'll check what scopes were consented. This is a particular case for enable offline access. So it's filtering the scopes. Okay. And then it creates a consent response given the scopes and if it should remember or not. Then raises the event. This is just informational, I believe. Right here is where this is persisted. So if there is a grant, uses this interaction service to grant consent, and it can be on the result can be redirected back to the client. This is like in the quick start, so we could roll most of it in a different way. Because I'm deleting it, I didn't want to bother with it, but it probably can be done in a clearer way. This is a bit convoluted, but it works for the demo purposes. So if no granted consent, then we must go back to the same UI so the user can fix the issues. And that's mostly it regarding this. I know I'm just being too fast on this, but I didn't invest much time on this page. And over here it's what I think is mostly expected. So it goes through the scopes. It is split, like we saw, personal information, then application access. So over here, the personal information is this identity scopes. And for each identity scope, it uses a partial to list the scope. The partial over here is just some shared to present information about each scope. So over somewhere the input and the display name, description. So back here, for each scope it lists that information, and then for resource scopes shows that scope information, then allow remember consent and all of that. Yeah, so you can take a look at their quick start, or if you want the Razor Pages version, you can take a look at this, but remember I just copied and adapted it. Yeah, and then we can allow. And all is working. So that's mostly it. I know probably I went fast on some parts and slow on others, but like usual, feel free to drop some questions, and hope to see you in the next one. See you.